Maya's fingers trembled slightly as she reached for Julian Sterling's collar, but her eyes were fixed on the world outside the window. In the quiet grandeur of the Sterling mansion, the morning air always carried the sharp, clean scent of lemon polish, a fragrance that reminded Maya of her mother's tireless work in houses, just like this one across New Orleans. She had been a ghost in these halls for 3 months, a young black woman whose presence was often overlooked by the high-powered men who came and went. This invisibility, however, had become her greatest asset, allowing her to notice the small, jagged edges of reality that others missed. The sunlight of early October filtered through the floor-to-ceiling windows, illuminating the intricate geometric patterns of the marble floor Maya had meticulously scrubbed the day before. Above them, the chandelier sparkled with a quiet arrogance, its crystals worth more than the modest home Maya shared with her family in the outskirts of the city. Julian Sterling stood before her, a man of 34 who carried the weight of an empire on his broad shoulders, his presence marked by the expensive notes of cedar and leather cologne. "You missed a spot," Julian remarked, his voice a low rumble that usually sent the other staff scurrying in fear. Maya did not flinch. She simply adjusted the Windsor knot of his tie with practiced grace, her knuckles briefly brushing the crisp, starched cotton of his white shirt. She looked past him, her gaze catching a sudden movement in the driveway. Caleb, the driver who had been a trusted fixture of the Sterling household for 5 years, was standing by the black SUV, his hand reaching toward his hip with a nervous, calculated twitch. The metallic glint of a gun barrel caught the morning light as Caleb shifted his jacket, his eyes darting toward his watch with a desperate determination that Maya recognized all too well. It was the look of a man about to cross a line from which there was no return. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but years of navigating the volatile moods of her neighborhood had taught her how to mask every emotion beneath a veil of calm. She stepped closer, smoothing the silk of Julian's tie one last time, her lips barely moving as she leaned in. "Your driver has a gun. Don't get in the car," she whispered, her voice so soft it was almost lost to the rustle of the curtains. Julian's entire body went rigid beneath her hands, the warmth in the foyer suddenly replaced by an icy tension. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath his freshly shaved skin as he processed the warning from the woman he had barely noticed until this very moment. Julian called out to his head of security, Marcus, his eyes never leaving Maya's face. Julian stood alone in his study, the amber liquid in his crystal glass reflecting a man who had just escaped an ambush. The room, lined with heavy leather-bound volumes and smelling of aged whiskey and old paper, felt like a sanctuary from the betrayal lurking just outside the mansion's gates. He watched through the window as Marcus and his security team led Caleb away. The driver's face was a mask of pale surrender, his hands raised in a gesture that confirmed Maya's chilling observation. Julian took a slow sip of his drink, the burn of the alcohol matching the intensity of his thoughts as he contemplated how a housemaid had seen what 5 years of professional loyalty had hidden. Caleb had been with the family for 5 years, proving that time doesn't always equal loyalty. Julian turned as Maya entered the room, her sensible black flats silent on the expensive Persian rug. She looked small against the massive mahogany desk, yet she didn't cower like the others often did. He gestured for her to sit in one of the deep leather chairs, a gesture of respect he rarely extended to staff. "The Callahans paid him $50,000 to drive me into a trap," Julian said, his voice stripped of its usual iron command. "How did you know? How did you see it when no one else did?" Maya clasped her hands in her lap to hide a faint tremor, her voice steady as she spoke of her past. She explained that growing up in a house where her father's moods changed with every bottle of whiskey had been her primary education. She had learned to read the tightening of a jaw, the nervous shift of a hip, and the desperate darting of eyes long before she learned to scrub a floor. "I learned to be invisible when I needed to, and bold when staying quiet would be worse," she said softly, her gaze meeting his without hesitation. Julian studied her, seeing not just a maid, but a woman whose resilience was forged in a fire he only partially understood. He leaned back, the leather creaking under his weight as he made a decision that would shift the foundation of his household. "I want you to work as my personal assistant," he stated, the offer sounding more like a decree of protection. "Your salary will triple, and you will move to the guest wing on the 3rd floor today." Julian watched the surprise flicker in her dark eyes, followed by a quiet, dignified acceptance. He realized then that he wasn't just hiring an observer. He was bringing a piece of genuine humanity into a world built on orchestrated fear. Julian admitted that Maya is the only person who treats him like a man, not a monster. As Maya calls her mother to share the news, she realizes her life has changed forever, but the danger has just begun. The charcoal dress delivered to Maya's room fit perfectly, a symbol of her new, visible life in the Sterling Empire. Gone were the shapeless cotton uniforms of a housemaid, replaced by a tailored fabric that felt like armor as she stood before the mirror in her new quarters on the third floor. The morning mist of New Orleans still clung to the sculpted hedges of the estate, but inside, Maya was preparing for a world far more treacherous than the one she had left behind. She smoothed the skirt, noting how the dark color complemented her skin, a quiet contrast to the opulent gold-leafed frames of the room. Julian had spent the afternoon in his ground-floor office, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with muscle as he reviewed logistics. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, gesturing for Maya to take the leather seat across from him. "Someone inside gave the Callahans my schedule," he said, his voice low and intense. "I need you to watch our partners tonight. Look for the nervousness that security misses. See who is lying before they ever pull a trigger." Maya nodded, her mind already cataloging the subtle shifts in body language she had practiced since childhood. The docks at midnight smelled of salt water, motor oil, and the heavy dampness of the Mississippi River. 3 black SUVs were parked in a semicircle, their headlights cutting through the thick darkness to reveal a single shipping container. Julian stood at the center of the formation, his presence commanding even in the shadows. Marcus and the security team formed a protective ring, their hands hovering near their holsters with practiced discipline. Maya stood slightly behind Julian, clutching a leather portfolio, her eyes scanning the clusters of men who had arrived to meet them. Russo, a heavy-set man with a swagger that suggested more ego than competence, approached them with a grin that didn't reach his eyes. "Punctual as always, Sterling," he called out, his men spreading out in a formation that felt less like a greeting and more like a siege. As Julian moved forward to inspect the crates of industrial equipment, Maya watched a man positioned near the water's edge. He wasn't looking at the cargo. His gaze kept shifting toward the dark patches of the pier, his hand making small, rhythmic gestures that were far too deliberate to be nervous fidgeting. Maya caught the reflection of metal gun barrels through the gap in the shipping container, catching the glint of snipers hidden in the shadows where the headlights could not reach. Her heart hammered, but she stepped closer to Julian, her voice a calm, steady thread in the cool night air. "Dante," she said quietly, using the name only he and her mother knew, 3 o'clock in the dark. "They have backup." Julian's body went rigid for a fraction of a second, but he didn't turn. He simply gave a subaudible command into his lapel mic, and suddenly the entire dock was illuminated by floodlights, catching the traders in a harsh, white glare. As Russo falls, Julian turns to Maya and says, "In my world, this kind of debt is permanent." The Sterling Mansion salon was a battlefield of silent judgments, where silver tea sets held more weight than words. The morning sun slanted through the tall windows, illuminating the fine dust motes dancing above the velvet upholstery, a scene of timeless New Orleans elegance that usually offered comfort. Today, however, Maya felt every inch of the distance between her world and the one she now inhabited. She smoothed the fabric of her tailored dress, standing before Eleanor Sterling, the matriarch whose presence was as formidable as the history of the house itself. Eleanor sat with a queen-like poise, her silver-streaked hair perfectly coiffed, her gaze sharp and penetrating as she moved with a grace that only decades of privilege could cultivate. Eleanor Sterling's gaze reminded Maya of the sharp-eyed women in her own neighborhood who could spot a lie from a mile away. It was a look that bypassed the expensive clothes and the new title, searching instead for the substance of the woman beneath the skin. Eleanor poured the tea with a steady hand, the delicate porcelain clicking softly against the saucer, a sound that, in this quiet room, felt like a summons. "Sit, dear," Eleanor said, her voice a low, cultured melody that brooked no refusal. As Maya took her seat, she realized this meeting wasn't about the foundation or the family business. It was about the man who stood at the center of their lives. Eleanor spoke of Julian with a mix of pride and a sadness that Maya had only glimpsed once before. She shared the story of Isabella, a woman who had once occupied the very chair Maya sat in now, only to leave a trail of betrayal that nearly destroyed their family. The warning was clear, delivered with the practiced gentleness of a woman who had seen empires rise and fall. Maya listened, her hands still and composed, her own experiences of survival giving her a depth of understanding that surprised the older woman. She did not offer hollow promises. She spoke of loyalty as a currency more valuable than any inheritance. Eleanor Sterling told Maya, "My son needs someone who isn't afraid of him," acknowledging Maya's unique place. In that moment, the tension in the room seemed to shift, the rigid boundaries of status softening into a shared concern for a man who had long walked the world alone. For a brief second, they weren't just the matriarch and the assistant. They were two women recognizing the same fire in each other, a fire of resilience and protective love. Julian entered the room then, his presence filling the space, his eyes immediately seeking out Maya to ensure she was comfortable, a small gesture that didn't go unnoticed by his mother. A frantic call from Marcus breaks the peace. The Callahan family has struck one of their clubs, leaving a message in blood. The humid New Orleans night felt like a trap, and for Maya, the silence of the library was the loudest warning of all. The heavy scent of rain-drenched jasmine drifted through the open window, but the usual comforting hum of the Sterling estate had vanished, replaced by an unnatural stillness that made the hair on her arms stand up. Maya set down her book, her instincts honed from years of surviving the unpredictable streets of her youth screaming that the perimeter had been breached. She reached for the small Glock Julian had insisted she carry, but before her fingers could close around the grip, the library door was kicked open with a force that shattered the wooden frame. Maya remembered Julian's fear for her safety that morning, a fear she now feels in every fiber of her being. 3 men in tactical gear swarmed the room, their movements professional and cold. She managed to fire once, the sound deafening in the enclosed space, but she was quickly overpowered, her face pressed into the expensive Persian rug as plastic zip ties bit into her wrists. They dragged her out through a side entrance, the cool night air hitting her face as a black hood was pulled over her head, plunging her world into a terrifying darkness. The warehouse they took her to on the New Orleans waterfront smelled of salt, rust, and stagnant water. When the hood was finally yanked off, Maya found herself sitting on a cold concrete floor, staring up at Victor Callahan, whose face was a mask of calculated malice. "You're the leverage I've been looking for," Victor sneered, his voice echoing in the vast, hollow space. He wanted to break the legendary Julian Sterling, to prove that his ice-cold logic was nothing more than a facade for the woman he had grown to love. Julian arrived alone, his silhouette framed by the harsh floodlights at the warehouse entrance. He didn't come with an army. He came with a desperation that Maya had never seen on his face. He moved toward the center of the room, his eyes fixed solely on Maya's bruised face, ignoring the guns pointed at his chest. Victor demanded the trade Maya's life for Julian's surrender. Without a second of hesitation, Julian dropped his weapon, the metallic clatter echoing across the concrete, and slowly lowered himself to his knees. Julian's simple admission, "I love her," as he surrenders his empire for her life. The words hit Maya harder than any blow from her captors, a profound confession of a man who had finally found something worth losing everything for. He knelt there, hands behind his head, a king stripped of his crown for the sake of a woman the world considered invisible. Antonio carries Maya out, leaving Julian chained and surrounded by enemies who want him dead. 3 years later, the mourning ritual had changed, but the hands that adjusted the tie were just as steady as the first time. The master bedroom of the Sterling estate was flooded with the soft, golden light of a New Orleans spring, a stark contrast to the shadows that had once dominated Julian's life. Maya moved with a quiet, confident grace, her fingers expertly smoothing the silk of Julian's tie as they had done 1,000 times before. He looked down at her not as an employer, but as a man who had found his anchor in a world that had tried to pull him under. The house no longer smelled only of cold lemon polish. It now carried the warm scent of baking bread and the joyful, chaotic energy of a home truly lived in. The ghost of the warehouse fight remains in the scars on Julian's knuckles, a badge of the life they rebuilt. Those marks were a permanent reminder of the night Julian had chosen a human soul over a criminal empire, a decision that had led to a long and difficult legal battle. With Maya's testimony and his mother's deep-rooted connections, the darkness of the past had been systematically dismantled. Julian had divested from the dangerous shadows, turning his vast resources toward legitimate enterprises that now thrived under a new philosophy of integrity and community. He was no longer a man to be feared, but a man respected for his capacity to change. Maya had found her own calling, far removed from the silent corridors of service. She now stood as the director of the Sterling Charitable Foundation, a role that allowed her to use her keen powers of observation to help those the world still chose to ignore. She had turned Julian's shadows into light, creating programs for education and empowerment in neighborhoods just like the one she had grown up in. As she finished the knot of his tie, a small, dark-haired girl named Sophia burst into the room, her laughter echoing like music, the living legacy of a love that had defied every din qian. Julian led Maya to the balcony overlooking the manicured gardens, where the morning mist was beginning to lift. He took her hand, the weight of the simple platinum ring on her finger a testament to their shared journey. He didn't need to speak of debts or obligations anymore. The look in his eyes told a story of profound gratitude and peace. He had spent his life building walls, only for Maya to show him that the greatest strength lay in the courage to let someone in. Together, they watched their daughter play in the sunlight, a symbol of a future they had fought to protect. Julian proposed properly, not out of debt, but out of a life fully shared. Maya looked at him, her heart full, realizing that the journey which began with a simple act of kindness had led to a transformation neither of them could have imagined. The world still had its challenges, and din qian would always linger in the corners of society, but within the walls of their home, they had created a sanctuary of truth and love. Maya whispers, "I saved your life that morning and every day since, as the cycle of kindness completes." As the golden sun sets over the quiet streets of New Orleans, the legacy of Maya and Julian reminds us that the most profound changes often begin with a single, quiet act of courage. In a world that often judges by the surface, they proved that true sight belongs to the heart, and that loyalty is a bridge that can cross any divide of status or skin. When we set aside our prejudices, we open the door to a compassion that can transform a stranger into a savior and a monster into a man. Like a lamp placed softly in a window, a simple act of unconditional kindness can guide us through the darkest paths of life, bringing us back to our shared humanity. Perhaps a simple smile or a watchful eye today can kindle a warm heart tomorrow, for in the end, kindness has a beautiful way of finding its way back to us.